Hey guys, Mrs. Fox here with your 5.4 Abolition and Women's Rights PowerPoint. Okay, go ahead and get your title written down. All right, get that EQ written down. If you need more time, then push pause because here we go. All right, Q1, the abolitionist movement. Write it down, highlight it yellow across the top of your page. All right, so abolitionist movement, what the heck is that? Most of the northern states, as you guys know, did not use a lot of slavery, right? It was the southern states that had a lot of slavery. So over time, throughout the early 1800s, a lot of the northern states had outlawed, one state at a time, slavery in their area because it just wasn't a profitable business there, and a lot of people who were anti-slavery lived in the north. Okay, also helping to create that divide between anti-slavery and slavery people was the fact that in 1807, the importations of African slaves from Africa became illegal in the US. So you could no longer be carried from Africa through that middle passage we learned about at the beginning of the year and sold at a slave auction. However, that doesn't mean slavery is illegal. If you already own slaves and they produce babies, as you know, those children do become slaves as well. So the slave trade was still thriving just with the slaves that we had within the United States. Nobody was coming over from Africa anymore, though, after 1807. So an abolitionist, guys, because in the early to mid 1800s, the abolitionist movement starts. The abolitionists are people who want to end slavery. These ranged from people who wanted it to end immediately, whether that was peacefully or violently, to people who were willing to look at phase-out plans over however many years to try to end slavery. You know, so the ideas about how to do it and when to do it and how violent or peaceful to do it varied, but that group of people who wanted to end slavery were called abolitionists. Okay, why did they think slavery was wrong? It varied from just the against the ideas of our country, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, you know, that whole thing, individual rights like the Bill of Rights that we learned about at the beginning of the year. A lot of people thought that it was morally wrong or was sinful and against the Bible. It encouraged immoral behavior. For example, there was a lot of abuse, rapes, physical and just mental torment, right, of that how white people treated slaves. Now remember, you guys, we say that and it was unfortunately very widespread and often true, but some slave owners were very nice to their slaves. You know, they're still slaves, so they couldn't have been that nice, right? But not every slave is mistreated that way. However, unfortunately, many of them were. All right, so that's kind of the abolitionist movement in a nutshell. Make sure that you're writing a question over on your left-hand side of your notes. If you need more time, push pause because you need to draw a line across everything you just wrote. And here we go to the next slide. All right, as you guys know, I don't show these in the flipped classroom. However, several of these are actually quite excellent, and I highly recommend that you at least pick a couple of them out and watch them, okay? You will understand what we're talking about so much better by doing that. So pick and choose, you know, time frames or groups that look interesting to you and watch a couple of those after we finish up the flipped classroom. Okay, Q2, early anti-slave efforts. Write it down, highlight it yellow. Okay, the anti-slave movement or the abolitionist thought, way of thought, was not a new idea. From the very beginning, when we were still colonies and there was slavery introduced, some people were against it. But it's something that built over time very slowly. Okay, but as early as the later 1700s, you already had famous people speaking out against slavery. For example, Ben Franklin made several anti-slave comments and stuff in the almanacs that he created and in speeches and things that he gave. William Lloyd Garrison, who's pictured on the bottom left over there, he's a very famous abolitionist who ran a widespread newspaper all about things going on with slavery and the anti-slave movement. John Quincy Adams, who you guys know is John Adams' son and our 6th president, right? He also tried to end slavery in 1839. He put an amendment through, but it never turned into a law. It did not pass. Okay, so there's some examples of early anti-slave efforts. Go ahead and put a question on the left-hand side. If you're not ready, push pause because here we go. Draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. Okay, again, we got some more video clips. Again, I'm not going to show them to you in the flipped classroom. Again, I highly recommend you pick 1 or 2 and watch them. You guys will understand the material quite a bit better. Do it. Do it. Do it. Do it. All right, so moving on to the next slide. Frederick Douglass. A lot of you guys have probably heard of him before. He's one of the most famous African-American abolitionists. He was born into slavery, worked on a plantation. At the age of 20, he managed to escape to the North, and he became a famous abolitionist speaker. Remember, abolitionist is anti-slavery, okay? He published an autobiography about his time as a slave and his escape to the North. He helped participate in the North Star anti-slavery newspaper. And additionally, he understood the plight of women as well. Women also had limited freedoms, more than African Americans did, but not as many as white men. So he also championed the women's rights movement as women tried to gain more rights in America. So Frederick Douglass, very famous figure, educated, despite it being illegal to educate a slave. He taught himself how to read. And was a mover and shaker in abolitionist circles. Okay, give yourself a question over on the left-hand side. If you're not ready, then push pause because here we go. Draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. All right, again, wow, look at this. Some more video clips for you guys. Do you have to watch them all? No. Would I recommend watching 1 or 2? Absolutely. Make sure you go back in and kind of pick and choose throughout this PowerPoint, guys. There's a lot of really good clips in here, some good information. Do it. Okay, moving on. Sojourner Truth, another famous abolitionist. She was also born into slavery and managed to escape. Her story became quite famous because Quakers, and if you guys remember studying Quakers a bit at the beginning of the year, they're a religious group that are like pacifists. They're anti-war. They thought everyone should be treated equally. They help her to escape to the North. She was a devout Christian, and she ultimately decides to change her name to Sojourner Truth. It was Isabella originally, but Sojourner meant journey, and truth is truth, right? So she was on a journey or a traveler of the truth because she thought the truth was everyone should be equal, women and men, black and white, and so on. So she's another one who not only impacts the anti-slavery movement, but also impacts the women's rights movement as well. And there she is on the left-hand side. Okay, so that's a little bit about Sojourner Truth. Again, make sure you highlighted anything that was super duper very important and you draw a line underneath everything you just wrote. Push pause if you're not ready. Get that left-hand side question going, okay? Because here we go. Next slide. Wow, more video clips. Okay, pick and choose, guys, pick and choose, but go back through this and watch some of these, okay? Such good information. Good things to know. Do it, do it, do it. You will thank yourself as you learn and grow. Work that brain out. All right. Okay, so this is an FYI slide. You don't have to write anything down on this slide. You're just listening, okay? This woman, whew, okay, so Harriet Jacobs was a slave who decided to write what she claims is her life story. And it's in a book. In fact, I own it. I studied it in one of my college classes. Some of you might as well. You can go into a Barnes & Noble and still find it. It's called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Okay, and let me give you a little bit of background. I'll kind of read through the bullet points for you guys a little bit just to give you an example of one slave's story and what's really going on. So she's born off into slavery in a well-off family. She's got both of her parents. However, they end up dying. Her mother dies by 6. Her father's gone. And so she ends up getting sent away to another plantation. Okay, so now she's separated from any friends or other family members that she knows, and she's off on her own at 6 years old at a whole new plantation. The new master teaches her to read and is a nice master. So at 6 years old, she got lucky and had some good time with someone who treated her well. However, that master dies. And then slaves are property, so she doesn't get her freedom. She gets willed out to whoever they left her to, right? Just like a desk or a, today a car or a house, right? So she's a piece of property. So unfortunately, the next master she has is really cruel. She's beaten a lot. She's threatened a lot. She is mentally abused quite a bit. He physically assaults her. He just is shy of raping her on multiple occasions. To try to thwart him, she starts a love affair with a white neighbor, a neighbor to this plantation, in hopes that that will like gross out her owner, and her owner's advances will stop because now she's involved with this neighbor person. She even ends up having a couple of kids with this white neighbor, Mr. Sands. As this relationship continues, she and Mr. Sands becomes close, but, she's definitely still a slave. They're not equals or anything by any means. She's hoping that she will get sold to Mr. Sands, but instead her owner sells or puts her into the field as punishment because she was a house slave. House slaves had easier days on the whole than a plantation field slave. So ultimately, she can't take it anymore. She's in fear of being raped. She's in fear of more abuse. She is miserable, and she escapes to her grandma's house, and she hides in an attic crawl space. I'm talking about a space, you guys, that is not big enough to stand up in. Okay, so she has to lay down. She can't even like fully sit up or anything. She's laying down. There's a hole in one of the walls that she can peek out of, and she watches her kids from that hole. She's in fear the entire time that Mr. Sands will sell her kids, or because they're his kids, or that her owner will sell the kids, or that she will be discovered, right? Ultimately what happens, one thing leads to another, and rather than coming back down and being punished or possibly killed for escaping into the crawl space, she stays there for 7 years. You have to understand how bad her life must have been for her to stay there for 7 years. If you laid in the same place more or less for 7 years and only were able to get up a couple of times during that 7 years, your muscles would atrophy, you would be extremely weak, your body would be very unhealthy. And she, from this little peephole, watched her kids grow up and watched people get beaten and, couldn't cry out and couldn't do anything because sitting there for 7 years was better than coming down and facing the consequences of the fact that she went to hide. Okay. Ultimately, what ends up happening, you can read the bullet points if you want more detail, but one by one, her kids and her end up in the North. Okay. She still has an owner, but her owner ends up freeing her, and she decides she's going to go try to be with her kids. And that's the perspective this book is written in. So there's just one example of somebody's story in slavery. Pretty horrific, pretty horrific. Okay, all right, Q5, Harriet Tubman, write it down, highlight it yellow, okay? Harriet Tubman, very famous, probably one of the most famous, her and Frederick Douglass, probably the most famous African-American abolitionists. A lot of you guys know Harriet Tubman. A movie called Harriet came out not that long ago, featuring her life story. She also started off as a slave. She ultimately escaped. Eventually, so many people are trying to escape to the North that they create this thing called the Underground Railroad, okay? And in the Underground Railroad, it's not actually a railroad. You're not going on a train. There's not train tracks, but it's underground because it's like, secret. And railroad terminology were the terms they used. Like if you were a leader trying to lead slaves up to the north, you were called a conductor, for example. And people coming with you were passengers. And places that were safe to stay were called railroad depots or stations, okay? And so that's where the Underground Railroad gets its name. All right, this 15 minutes is going to be up in about 10 seconds, so join me for part two to get the rest of this PowerPoint, all right? Look for part 2. See you guys then. All right.